You break a serious rule today and you know roughly what happens. Handcuffs, a booking desk, a cell with a locked door, maybe for a few nights, maybe for years. It's such a familiar part of modern life that it barely feels like a choice society made. It feels like the natural consequence of doing something wrong. But here's the strange part. For more than 90% of human history, that room didn't exist. There was no cell waiting for you, no locked door, no sentence measured in years, so when someone broke the rules in a world with no prisons, what actually happened to them? The answer is far more social, far more personal, and in some ways far more brutal than anything you'd find in a modern courtroom. Start with the earliest human societies. Small hunter-gatherer bands rarely larger than a few dozen people. There was no police force, no judge, no building designed to hold someone against their will. And yet these societies weren't lawless. They had rules, and they enforced them. Just not with walls. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying how small-scale egalitarian societies maintain order without centralized authority. His research describes a graduated system of social pressure that most of these groups relied on. It usually started small, gossip, the kind of quiet, circulating conversation that let everyone in the group know exactly what you'd done, whether you wanted them to or not. There was nowhere to hide from it. In a band of 30 people who depended on each other for food, protection, and survival, reputation wasn't a soft social nicety. It was currency. Losing it had real consequences. If gossip didn't correct the behavior, the group escalated. Public ridicule came next, mockery designed specifically to humiliate, sometimes performed in front of the entire band. Boehm's work suggests this wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated tool, a way of applying pressure without yet resorting to violence or permanent exile. If that failed too, the band moved to something far more serious. Ostracism. You could be pushed out of the group entirely, left to survive alone in an environment where survival alone was often close to a death sentence. Human beings did not evolve to make it on their own. Isolation from the band wasn't just social punishment. In many environments, it was functionally close to execution, just slower and quieter. And if someone was violent, repeatedly dangerous, or seen as a genuine threat to the group's survival, the band sometimes made the harder decision directly. Execution, carried out not by a single ruler or a court, but by collective agreement among the group itself. Boehm's research specifically found that in several documented egalitarian societies, killing a chronically dangerous member was treated less like a dramatic event and more like the group performing necessary maintenance on itself. No cell, no sentence, no appeal. Just a decision made together, then carried out. It sounds harsh by modern standards, but look at the logic underneath it. These societies had no resources to spare on housing, feeding, and guarding someone for years while they served a sentence. Punishment had to be immediate, visible, and cheap, or the group itself couldn't function. A prison is, in many ways, a luxury that requires surplus. Small early societies simply didn't have one. Move forward to the first real cities, and the picture starts to shift, though maybe not the way you'd expect. Mesopotamia gave us some of the earliest written law codes in human history, and the most famous, the Code of Hammurabi, is often remembered today for its harsh-sounding phrase, an eye for an eye. Most people assume that meant ancient punishment was simply brutal, tit-for-tat violence carried out on a massive scale. But legal historian Raymond Westbrook, who spent much of his career studying cuneiform law, found something more complicated when he examined how these laws actually functioned in practice. In the vast majority of documented cases, the literal eye for an eye punishment wasn't what happened at all. Instead, the far more common outcome was restitution, fines, compensation paid directly to the victim or their family, calibrated carefully based on the harm done and the social status of the people involved. Westbrook's research suggests something genuinely important here. Ancient Mesopotamian justice wasn't primarily about making the offender suffer. It was about restoring balance to a relationship that had been damaged. If you injured someone, you didn't necessarily lose a body part in return. You paid. Silver, grain, livestock, whatever matched the harm. The victim was made whole, or as close to whole as the situation allowed, and the offender kept their labor, their family, and their place in the community, because a society running on manual agriculture and skilled trade couldn't easily afford to remove productive people from daily life for years at a time. This restitution-based approach echoes across many other ancient legal systems, sometimes in a very literal form. Among early Germanic tribes centuries later, this system had a name: Wehrgild, meaning man price. Every person in the society was assigned a specific monetary value based on their social status. If you killed someone, you didn't necessarily face execution yourself. Your family paid the dead person's Wehrgild to their family instead. It sounds almost transactional to modern ears, reducing a human life to a number. But functionally, it did something a modern prison sentence often struggles to do. It directly compensated the people who were actually harmed, rather than simply removing the offender from society and hoping that counted as justice. Not every ancient punishment was this restrained, of course. Public corporal punishment was extremely common across almost every ancient civilization. Flogging, branding, mutilation, carried out specifically in front of crowds. And that public element wasn't incidental. It was the entire point. Without newspapers, courts records, or any centralized system for tracking who had committed what crime, public punishment served as the announcement itself. If you couldn't look up someone's criminal history, you needed to see the scar, the brand, or the missing hand to know what they'd done. The body became the record because no other record existed. Exile also shows up constantly throughout ancient history, though its form varied enormously depending on the society. In ancient Athens, the practice of ostracism became remarkably formal. Once a year, citizens could vote to banish someone from the city for 10 years. Not necessarily because that person had committed a specific crime, but because the community judged them a threat to political stability. No trial, no specific charge, just a vote, shards of broken pottery scratched with a name, and a decade spent somewhere else. Rome relied heavily on debt bondage and enslavement as consequences for certain offenses, particularly unpaid debts, which meant punishment in the ancient world was frequently tied directly to economic status. Wealthy offenders paid fines and walked away. Poor offenders who had nothing to pay with often lost their freedom entirely, working off what they owed through forced labor that could last years, sometimes indefinitely. So, where does the modern prison, the building specifically designed to hold people for extended punishment, actually come from? Here's where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn. It's newer than almost anyone assumes. Philosopher and historian Michel Foucault, in his influential examination of the history of punishment, argued that the prison, as a primary tool of criminal justice, is largely a product of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Not an ancient institution at all. Before that shift, imprisonment existed, but it was mostly used to hold people awaiting trial or awaiting a different punishment entirely, not as the punishment itself. Foucault's research traced how European societies gradually moved away from punishing the body in public, the flogging, the branding, the execution in the town square, toward a completely different model, punishing the mind instead, privately, through isolation, routine, surveillance, and discipline, carried out behind walls the public could no longer see. That's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. The prison cell, the thing that feels like the timeless, obvious response to crime, is actually a relatively recent invention, built on an entirely different theory of what punishment is supposed to accomplish. Ancient societies weren't trying to reform someone's inner character through years of controlled isolation. They were trying to restore balance, protect the group, and make the consequences visible enough that everyone understood exactly where the line was. Which system actually worked better is a much harder question than it first appears, and historians are still genuinely divided on it. Restitution-based systems could repair harm directly, but they also meant that wealth could buy your way out of almost anything, while poverty turned even minor offenses into life-altering sentences of forced labor. Public corporal punishment created instant, visible deterrence, but it also produced permanent physical marks that followed people for the rest of their lives with no path back to a clean slate. And collective decisions made by hunter-gatherer bands, execution by consensus, banishment into near-certain death carried almost none of the due process protections that modern legal systems consider absolutely essential. Consider, too, how differently these systems treated the idea of a second chance. In a Vorgild society, once the payment was made, the debt was formally, legally closed. The killer's family and the victim's family were expected to move forward without lingering vendetta, at least in theory, because the whole point of the payment was to prevent an endless cycle of retaliation. Compare that to a modern criminal record, which can follow someone for the rest of their life, quietly closing doors to jobs, housing, and opportunity decades after the original offense. In some very narrow sense, a society that forced you to pay a debt and then declared it settled offered a cleaner form of closure than one that keeps the door open to renewed judgment indefinitely. There's no clean answer here. No ancient system you can point to and say, it was simply better than what we have now. What all of this actually reveals is something more unsettling. The specific shape of punishment has never been fixed. It has shifted again and again across thousands of years, driven by what a given society could afford, what it valued, and what it feared. The prison cell feels permanent and obvious only because it's the version you happen to grow up inside of. So the next time you picture what happens when someone breaks the rules, remember that the locked door and the cell block aren't some ancient universal answer humanity arrived at long ago. They're one experiment among many still being tested. You break a serious rule today, and you know roughly what happens. But for nearly all of human history, the room with the locked door simply didn't exist. What existed instead was something far more direct, a community deciding together, in full view of everyone, exactly what your actions were worth. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.